What if one of the technologies helping power Europe's clean energy transition also introduced a security risk that most people have never even considered? That is now becoming part of a much bigger conversation after Europe began restricting certain high-risk solar inverters from countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea in some renewable projects over cybersecurity concerns. At first glance, this might sound like a dramatic overreaction or another geopolitical headline designed to grab attention. But the reality is much more interesting than that. This is not really a story about solar panels. It is a story about what happens when energy infrastructure becomes smarter, more connected, and increasingly dependent on digital systems. For years, most conversations around renewable energy focused on familiar problems like cost, battery storage, transmission, and grid stability. Those are still important issues. But as renewable systems evolve, another layer is quietly becoming more important in the background. Security, and not physical security. Digital infrastructure security. That shift is what makes this story much bigger than it initially sounds. When most people think about solar energy, they picture solar panels sitting on rooftops or spread across massive solar farms quietly generating electricity from sunlight. But panels are only one part of a much larger system. Solar panels generate electricity, but they do not independently manage how that electricity gets converted, distributed, stored, or sent into wider infrastructure. That role is handled by a different piece of equipment that most people rarely think about: the inverter. The inverter is one of the most important parts of many solar systems because it manages how solar-generated electricity interacts with homes, batteries, commercial systems, and the wider power grid. Without it, much of the energy generated by solar panels would not be usable in the way modern systems require. In simple terms, if solar panels are the producers, the inverter is part of the control center. That is why this issue is focused much less on the panels themselves and much more on the systems controlling how renewable energy actually functions. One important nuance that often gets lost in sensational headlines is that this conversation is largely about newer and increasingly connected renewable systems. Older solar systems were generally simpler. Many earlier systems operated with fewer smart functions, less remote connectivity, and lower software dependency. They were designed primarily to convert and distribute energy, often without the more advanced communication and monitoring features that have become common in modern installations. That is partly why concerns today are much more focused on newer systems. Modern renewable infrastructure increasingly includes software updates, firmware management, remote diagnostics, cloud-based monitoring, battery optimization tools, communication protocols, and smart grid integrations. These features make systems more efficient, easier to monitor, and easier to scale across larger networks. From an operational standpoint, this is a major improvement. But every layer of connectivity also introduces another layer of complexity. And complexity introduces new forms of risk. This is not unique to renewable energy. We have already seen similar patterns across telecoms, cloud infrastructure, semiconductors, and other forms of digitally connected critical infrastructure. Renewables are simply entering that same phase. This issue gained more attention after reports in 2025 suggested undocumented communication devices or communication components had been found in some Chinese-made solar inverters and battery systems. Naturally, this triggered immediate concern. Because if a critical infrastructure system contains undocumented communication capabilities, people immediately begin asking uncomfortable questions about visibility, access, auditing, and control. Could systems theoretically be accessed remotely? Could certain functions be manipulated? Could dependencies on foreign-controlled infrastructure introduce long-term strategic risks? These were the types of concerns that quickly followed. But here is where nuance becomes extremely important. Later U.S. investigations reportedly found no definitive evidence of intentionally malicious hidden devices. Some of the undocumented communications reportedly discovered were later described as non-malicious or non-intentional. That distinction matters a lot, because this is not a proven sabotage story. This is better understood as a trust, transparency, and infrastructure governance issue. And from a policy perspective, those concerns can still matter even without malicious proof. Even without definitive malicious findings, Europe appears to be taking a more cautious position. The EU is reportedly restricting certain high-risk solar inverter technologies from countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea in some EU-funded renewable projects. This is important to understand properly. This is not a retroactive panic response where previously installed systems are suddenly being removed en masse or rendered unusable. People who already have systems installed are generally not being told to replace functioning infrastructure because of these newer restrictions. Instead, the focus is more strategic. Future procurement, future infrastructure standards, future supplier decisions. That distinction is critical because it changes the story from Europe discovered dangerous solar systems to something much more realistic and much more important. Europe is increasingly asking a strategic infrastructure question. How dependent should critical renewable infrastructure be on suppliers considered high risk? That is a very different conversation. This is where the story becomes much larger than solar technology. The real concern is not simply whether one product contains one specific risk. The larger concern is concentration. When a growing share of critical infrastructure depends heavily on a relatively concentrated supplier ecosystem, dependency risk naturally increases. That risk can be economic. It can be operational. It can be geopolitical. Or it can be strategic. This is not a new concern globally. We have seen similar conversations around telecom networks, semiconductor supply chains, cloud service dependency, and rare earth processing. Renewable energy is now entering that same strategic category, and that changes how governments think. Renewable energy is no longer just an environmental conversation. It is becoming foundational infrastructure. Solar systems now interact with battery storage systems, smart grids, industrial facilities, commercial operations, EV charging networks, transport systems, and increasingly digitized energy networks. As countries electrify more sectors of their economies, renewable infrastructure becomes more central to everyday life. That means system resilience matters more. Supply chain visibility matters more. Auditability matters more. Software governance matters more. This is why the conversation is shifting beyond simple questions like how much solar capacity was added this year. Now governments are increasingly asking deeper questions. Who manufactures the systems? Who controls software layers? Who manages updates? Who has visibility into connected infrastructure? Those questions did not matter as much in older energy systems. They matter much more now. If this trend continues, we may begin seeing stricter standards emerge across renewable procurement and infrastructure development. This could include tighter supplier screening, stronger software auditing requirements, clearer hardware certification standards, and potentially stronger incentives for local or regional manufacturing. That would not necessarily slow renewable adoption, but it could reshape the competitive landscape. It could also create new business opportunities in areas like energy cybersecurity, infrastructure auditing, grid resilience, and trusted hardware ecosystems. In other words, this is not just a risk story. It may also become an industry evolution story. Renewable energy is often presented as a simple transition from fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives. But the real transition is more complicated than that. It is also a transition from relatively traditional infrastructure toward highly connected digital infrastructure. And digital infrastructure introduces entirely new categories of complexity. That does not mean renewable energy is suddenly unsafe or problematic. Far from it. It simply means the industry is maturing. As systems become more sophisticated, conversations naturally become more sophisticated too. Cost still matters. Storage still matters. Transmission still matters. But now security is becoming part of that conversation as well. And that is likely to remain true as renewable systems become even more deeply integrated into modern economies.